preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening once again. Before I introduce our guest for tonight, I have a couple of announcements. I always think that a prerequisite to an evening on Judaism in some way has to have a couple of announcements. So as not to let anybody down, I have actually two of them tonight. First of all, a reminder that the final evening of our series, the Forum on Contemporary Values, is March 30th. That's Tuesday evening, March 30th, when Joseph and I will be joined by the Chief of Police of Charleston, South Carolina, Reuben Greenberg. Chief Greenberg is the first African-American Chief of Police of Charleston, South Carolina, and he is Jewish. Actually, now that I think about it, he's probably the first Jewish Chief of Police of Charleston. Actually, one thing I am certain, he is the first African-American Jewish police chief. In any event, he has also had tremendous impact on reducing violent crime in Charleston, and our topic that evening is Let's Take Back Our Streets. There are tickets available, and we look forward to seeing you. That's Tuesday, March 30th. The second announcement is that inside the brochures that were handed out to you this evening is a little insert about the Friends of the 92nd Street Y. Friends of the Y help support all of our programs here. This year, our programs in Jewish education include lectures and seminars, about 30 different classes. Many of you were here for the evening where we discussed the Shema with rabbis from the different movements together, an evening on U.S.-Israel relations last month with a couple of former ambassadors and others. We have a Passover Seder coming up and a program about Holocaust denial with Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. I think the Y is working very hard. I know we're working very hard to try to bring Jewish education and Jewish values into the lives of those who study with us. You probably also know that Jewish programs are not self-supporting, and that we give scholarships to virtually everyone who asks for them here so that they can explore Judaism. We try to make it very welcoming. If tonight, any money that you give to the Friends of the Y will be notated to go directly to Jewish education programs in the Bronfman Center. And on behalf of those whose lives that you touch with your gifts, the 92nd Street Y will say thank you. And now to our guest. Rabbi Harold Kushner is Rabbi Laureate of Temple Israel in Natick, Massachusetts, having served that congregation for 24 years. He is best known as author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, an international bestseller, first published in 1981. The book has been translated into 12 languages and was recently selected by members of the Book of the Month Club as one of the 10 most influential books of recent years. He has also written When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough, which was awarded the Christopher Medal for its contribution to the exaltation of the human spirit, When Children Ask About God, and Who Needs God. His new book, To Life, a celebration of Jewish being and thinking, has just been published. And having read it this week, I can say, incidentally, that it's a moving volume on the beauty and the depth of Judaism. Incidentally, as you probably know, Rabbi Kushner's books have a habit of going into many printings. And as I'm sure you know, first editions are particularly valuable. Tonight in the lobby, we have among the first editions of the first edition, and they're available to you. Rabbi Kushner was born in Brooklyn and graduated from Columbia University. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1960 and awarded a doctoral degree in Bible in 1972. He has 5 honorary doctorates, has studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, at the Harvard Divinity School, and has taught at Clark University and the Rabbinical School of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And we are very happy that you are here this evening.
David, thank you. The Y has always been a very special place for me, and I'm privileged to be part of your series. Seems to me, though, that there was one element missing from your introduction. A complete Jewish evening begins with announcements and solicitations for contributions. It ends with refreshments, and I didn't hear you mention that.
I'm glad that you're here for your final visit, Rabbi Kushner, to the Well, the truth is, if enough money is raised tonight, we'll have refreshments for future evenings.
I can't think of a better cause.
How nice. Harold, perhaps more than any other rabbi, you have spoken before audiences that were not Jewish, that are not Jewish. And until now, while Judaism is clearly central to your views, your books have been directed towards people of all faiths. They have, in a sense, a universal message. Your new book, To Life, a celebration of Jewish being and thinking, is the first time that Jewish appears in the title of any of your books. What's the message that you want to direct specifically to Jews?
The first message, I think, is that some subjects, it doesn't make sense to separate into Jewish and non-Jewish. At a certain level, when you're dealing with the human response to tragedy, to mortality, to the nourishment that the soul needs, it's meaningless to talk about Jewish truth as it would be to talk about Jewish chemistry or Jewish mathematics. But there comes a point where I just wanted to speak in the specific language of one religious tradition, the one that I know. There comes a point where all religions are not the same, and specific religions have specific emphases. In addition, I really thought one of the things I wanted to do, having gained a certain credibility with the Jewish book-buying and book-reading public, because my books had been accepted across the board, there were things I wanted to tell them about Judaism that they probably didn't know. I characterized this book as one for everybody who had a bad Hebrew school experience as a child. I wrote it for people who are thoughtful, literate, sophisticated, well-educated, and for one reason or another simply have no idea of the depth, the richness, the vitality, the indispensability of the Jewish tradition. And I thought if they would read a book, because they'd read other books Harold Kushner has written, this is the message I wanted to share with them.
What are some of the special Jewish emphases that you focus on?
Oh, Joe, you make it too easy. I mean, you ask one question, I'm going to speak for the next hour on that. Maybe the most important is the emphasis Judaism puts on the fact that human beings are different from animals. I think America is not a Christian nation. America is a pagan nation. The American consensus increasingly is human beings are just a different species of animal, and all their urges are legitimate. If you are sexually aroused, it is unhealthy to repress it. If you're angry, you have every right to lash out. It's only natural. It is unnatural to hold these instincts in check. The message of Judaism, more articulate, I think, than in the other religious traditions that are current in this country, is that a human being is very different from an animal. I tell the story in the book of when I enrolled in Columbia in 1951, I wanted to be a psychology major, and the first thing I did was sign up for the introductory psychology course. The first week I was there, I found out that the psychology department had been taken over by what is known as the experimentalist school. That is, they didn't talk about how the human soul works. You counted how many times a white rat pressed the bar if you gave him a reward every time he pressed it. After 3 hours of doing this, I went up to the professor and I said, you know, I happen to believe that human beings are different from rats, and it's the difference that I'm interested in understanding. And he looked at me very condescendingly and said, young man, the purpose of this course is to prove that you're wrong. I dropped my major, changed it to literature, and I never went back. I think Judaism taught me, and I think it has the potential to teach us all, that human beings are different from animals. That what makes us unique is that we can do what no other living creature can do. We can say no to instinct. It is natural to lash out when you're angry, but it is human to withhold that anger. It is natural to respond when you're sexually aroused. It is human to control that sense of arousal. I think we need to articulate this against the background of a society that says, if it feels good, go ahead and do it, and don't let anybody tell you you're wrong. That's one example. I could probably give you 12 more.
Why do you think in American society there's been a shift increasingly in that direction?
Because it's a lot more fun to be a pagan than to be human. It's a lot easier to give in to your instincts. There seems to be a moral law of gravity, just like there's a physical law of gravity, that says it's easier to sleep late than to get up early to go to services. It's easier to keep the money for yourself than to give it to people in need. It's easier to hide behind a lie than to tell an embarrassing truth. And people tend to take the easy way. The voice of religion needs to articulate the message that there are rewards painfully obtained which come with taking the hard road to being human.
I think that it's also very dangerous. It's also very dangerous that people are no longer capable of making a distinction between the value of human life and the value of animal life. I think you quote Dennis Prager, a friend of ours, when he gives an example of a woman who he asked if her dog were drowning, if her dog and a stranger were drowning, which would she save first? And she really contemplates the question for a while. And I know that Dennis has gone around the country asking high school students and then adults that question, and he gets virtually the same response each time. A third of the people say they would save their dog, a third say they would save the stranger, and a third say they want to contemplate the question for a while. And every time when asked to those who would save the stranger why they would save the dog, why they would save the dog, they respond, because I love the dog, I don't love the stranger, I follow love. That was fine until one evening on Thanksgiving. I raised it to not my immediate family, but we had a family gathering. And I found out that indeed much of my own family had very strong feelings about their dogs, much stronger than they had about their own, than a stranger, which I began to understand because it reflected the death of religion and, in a sense, the removal of God. What's the case that you make that human beings are more valuable than animals?
The case, I think, would be that there is something unique in a human being that we have to respond to. Human beings have the capacity to do what no other living creature can do, that only God can do. That is to fashion holiness, to take the ordinary and sanctify it. If I had to summarize the Torah in one sentence, that's pretty close to what it would be. The Torah teaches us how to take the ordinary and to make it special, how to turn a weekend into a Sabbath, how to turn a meal into an opportunity to express discipline and gratitude, how to turn the attraction of a man and a woman for each other into something holy. Only human beings can do that. When you value that, then I think you respond to the human being. I'm sympathetic to, let's say, the plight of animals that are used for testing. I contribute to funds that try and help animals, lobby for humane treatment of animals. My family is vegetarian, partly for a whole lot of reasons, but partly out of a sense of sympathy. And yet, when we had a child who was incurably ill, had a doctor said to us, we have a medication that will keep your child alive, but in order to procure it, we have to kill every single member of a certain species of monkey, except for one male and one female. I would have insisted that they do it. Because for me, a human life, not just my child's life, a human life is much more valuable than an animal life.
I'm curious to broaden it beyond the scope of this issue of animal and human life. Your books until now have, in a sense, generally dealt with the broad issues of religion, obviously the issues of suffering and theodicy and existential search for meaning. In light of what you're saying, have you found, are rituals more important to you in your life now than they were 25 years ago?
That's a hard question to answer because, Joe, 25 years ago I was a congregational rabbi. I was getting paid for keeping rituals. 3 years ago I retired from the congregational rabbinate. They're not more important to me now, they're differently important. That is, what I've come to appreciate, I think, is the dimension of the human being which transcends the rational. In shorthand, which I trust a sophisticated audience like this will need no explanation for, the right brain dimension of doing things. I appreciate the fact that rituals nourish the right brain. They give us the opportunity to do things that don't make sense. We got an example coming up in just a couple of weeks. All over America, in Jewish families, children will go to a Pesach Seder at a grandparent's home, at their parents' table, wherever it is. They will do things they don't understand. They will drink wine, they will eat matzah, they will taste the charoset, the bitter herb. That will speak to them at a level that their Hebrew teachers cannot reach. It will speak to them emotionally. Taking little children to synagogue, holding them up to kiss the Torah, says something to them. Inviting your children to be present with you when you light the Sabbath candles. There is a kind of a trans-rational, right brain nourishment that goes on with these things. One of the flaws of liberal religion, Reform, conservative Judaism, liberal Protestant Christianity in this country, one of the real shortcomings of the liberal church and synagogue is we were so intellectually self-conscious, we did not do anything that didn't make sense. And I once characterized that as being a little bit like lifting the hood of my car and throwing out everything I found, the function of which I didn't understand. The Reform movement, for example, got rid of a lot of things they didn't understand. Dietary laws, circumcision, the Sabbath, Zionism, a lot of things which offended their 19th century rational mentality, and they've spent much of the last half of the 20th century trying to find these things and put them back.
I want to bring it back to the Jewish message to humanity a little bit. If you feel that the Jews have a unique message to share. To me, the greatest issue for most young Jews today, maybe not just young Jews, but certainly Jews in their 20s and 30s, is they see no real reason to take Judaism seriously. Mm-hmm. They've been taught how to be Jewish, how to observe Shabbat, perhaps how to observe the dietary laws, but not why to do them. There's no sense of role for Jews, no sense of task for Jews. The concept of chosenness, many find problematic at best. What specifically do the Jewish people have to offer the world? And what would you say to a young Jew, or tell a young Jew as to why they should remain Jewish? In other words, especially in America, in a society which has been so open to Jews and where Jews have been relatively successful, assimilated quite easily, the great bulk of Jews don't see any reason to take their Judaism seriously.
No, you're absolutely right. Those are two different questions. Why should a Jew remain Jewish, and what do we have to say to the world? Let me deal with them seriatim. There's a story I love that they tell about Chaim Weizmann, who would go on to become the first president of Israel. 75 years ago, when he was lobbying for the Balfour Declaration, a British legislator said to him, Weizmann, why do you Jews insist on Palestine? There are so many countries you could have more conveniently. And Weizmann said, that's like my asking you, why did you drive 20 miles to visit your mother last Sunday? There's so many old ladies living on your street. The first reason for Jews to remain Jewish is it's theirs. You're not obliged to love your parents because you have objectively taken a survey of all the families in your neighborhood and decided that your parents are the most lovable. You love them because they're yours. They gave you life, they raised you, you owe them something. It's not a reward for being good parents, it's an obligation because they're your parents. You start out committed to Judaism. It's one of the circumstances of your birth, and it takes an act of transplantation to become something else. That's the first reason.
You start out committed to Judaism, or you start out Jewish?
Well, that's what I meant, really. You start out Jewish.
No, but that's the big problem.
Oh, obviously, you don't start out committed, but you start connected to Judaism before you even realize what's going on. I mean, this is the whole idea of a bris. The idea that at age 1 week, a child goes through this ceremony not to make him Jewish, to celebrate the fact that he is Jewish, to express the idea of the covenant, the idea that the covenant is painful, the idea that the covenant is passed on from generation to generation. You start with this sense of involvement. You don't have to choose it. You don't have to take a course in comparative religion and decide that Judaism makes more sense than anybody else. You really have to go through a major transplantation to become anything other than Jewish. That's the first answer. The second answer is...
I just want to challenge you a little bit.
Go right ahead.
I don't think you do have to go through a major transplantation. You're Jewish. Most Jews don't become anything else, they just don't stay Jewish. They're Jewish in terms of the fact that they will always be a Jew since they were born Jewish. Mm-hmm. But Judaism, for too many Jews, isn't a great part of their lives. It doesn't impact their decisions as much as we would hope it would impact. It certainly isn't enough of their lives to ensure that they will marry somebody that is Jewish. Mm-hmm. Clearly something happens from the day a boy is circumcised or a girl has a simchat bat, a celebration of the birth of a Jewish daughter. There's something missing there, so that at 25 years old, Judaism, for too many of them, isn't central enough in their lives.
No, you're absolutely right, and this is really the second question you asked. That is when, usually it's not the child, the 25-year-old young person who comes to me. When I was a congregational rabbi, it would be the parents. And they would say, can you do something about our 25-year-old son and his non-Jewish girlfriend? And at that point, it's a little bit late. I don't think I have ever been successful in talking a Jewish young person out of marrying a specific non-Jew when they were in love. It's a lot easier to talk to 16-year-olds in the abstract. All I can say to them is, if you're going to enter into a marriage where you and your spouse will share different religious traditions, the danger is not that Judaism will collapse. I'm prepared to bet that Judaism will survive without you if it has to. The danger is that you will make the tacit agreement that religion will not matter to you. because it's only going to become controversial. That's the big flaw, the big hazard in intermarriage. And this is the second question you asked. What is there in Judaism that will motivate me to feel I should dedicate my life to taking it seriously? Part is what it does for me. It shows me, it teaches me how to fulfill my latent humanity. The other part is what it permits me to do for the world. The process of elevating, of sanctifying, of purifying the world, of showing the world what the God-oriented life looks like. I am convinced there is an instinctive hunger in people to live a life that means something. We want to do more than simply live, get married, pay our bills, grow old, watch television, die. We want to know we've made our mark on the world. Judaism teaches us how to do that. How to know that you have really made the world discernibly different. You don't have to write a great novel, you don't have to find the cure for AIDS. Just living a life in which you take the ordinary and sanctify it, which is something that only God and human beings can do. Knowing you have done that, knowing you have taught the world to take morality seriously, it doesn't have to be the whole world. It could be 10 people, it could be 30 people. This already changes the quality of your life. This already elevates it from the mundane existence to the existence of really making a difference. I've spent 30 years as a congregational rabbi trying to teach people that if you do this, you're going to feel very different about your life, and that's the best reason to take your Jewishness seriously.
I'm curious, given that you characterize paganism as being a strong, though it might not explicitly be called paganism, it's a strong alternative religion in America, I would gather you probably would be quite up for Jews seeking converts. Because it's one thing to say Jews should seek converts in a primarily Christian society, where in a sense that's an offensive thing to do, to try and dissuade people from their own religious traditions. But paganism, I assume you would feel comfortable being quite proselytizing.
I would rephrase that with your permission, Joe. I think Jews should welcome converts, and Jews should seek to teach people to find God, not necessarily by becoming Jewish. My own sense, my take, as it were, on Christianity is that Jesus and Paul were God's instruments for bringing the morality of the Torah to the wider world. I don't think we could have done it without the kind of act of translation that the founders of Christianity go through. I think Judaism is probably a little too, what's the word I'm looking for, too intense, too concentrated. I can't imagine a world in which there would be 1 billion Jews. I mean, it would no longer be Judaism. Look what happened to Christianity. When Christianity suddenly expanded from being a hardcore of a few thousand devotees to being the official religion of the Roman Empire, and in a matter of months, you had 100 times as many Christians or 1,000 times as many Christians as you did 6 months ago, something happened to Christianity. It became very successful, it became much more powerful, and it became entangled in paganism, so that the December celebration of the birth of Jesus was first of all moved to the winter solstice, celebrated with evergreen trees. The festival of his resurrection became involved with rabbits and eggs and all signs of spring fertility. The role of his mother suddenly took on a lot of the trappings of the goddess worship of pagan life. A process of dilution of the message of Christianity entered in. It was inevitable. I mean, if you're going to suddenly welcome...
So in other words, the issue is not intrinsically that Judaism couldn't be a mass religion, but you seem to be saying the issue is that virtually any religion, when it becomes a mass movement, has to incorporate people with such a diversity of views that the religion itself will get attenuated.
I'm saying two things, Joe. One is that a religion which grows too fast cannot maintain quality control, just as a corporation, a factory that grows too fast. If an automobile maker suddenly had to put out 1,000 times as many cars next year as it did this year, it cannot maintain quality control. The second thing I'm saying, and this is the more important thing, is that there is an element of Judaism, there is a dimension of Judaism which would be lost if there were 1 billion Jews in the world. That sense of connection I have when I travel to I was in Phoenix, Arizona last week speaking to a convention of dentists. Maybe 10% of the people there were Jewish. They were strangers to me, but somehow we sought each other out. You know what happens. I'm sure you guys have done the same thing. I'm sure the people out there have done the same thing. You're in a large group, maybe you're traveling somewhere in Europe, you're at a convention. Jews find each other. There is a sense in which we cared about the Jews of Soviet Russia, whom we did not know and probably wouldn't like if we knew them. We cared about them in a way that my Catholic neighbor doesn't care about Catholics in Croatia or in Lebanon. Why? Because there is this sense of kinship. There is a sense that there are so few of us that everyone is precious. The Jew who is a member of Clinton's cabinet, the Jew who embarrasses us with crime, the Jew who dies in an accident, we feel personally about that person, though we've never met him, because of the smallness. There is something very precious about that, and it is a part of Judaism. It's not simply a statistical quirk. I really think it is part of the nature of Judaism that we are a community more than we are a belief system. And if we had been as successful as Christianity was, I'm afraid that would have gotten lost. So to get back to your original question, I think Jews should welcome converts, one, because it's the best possible way of solving the intermarriage dilemma by having the husband and wife agree to share a single religion. Two, there is a place in Judaism for what the Kabbalists called the Jewish soul mistakenly born into a Gentile body. That is the potential convert I would meet who will tell me, my best friend in high school was Jewish, my roommate in college was Jewish, I read Exodus 3 times and I cried. I've always been attracted to Jewish people, Jewish causes, and that's why I find myself engaged to this young Jewish man who conversely will say, all my best friends were Gentiles and all the girls I dated were Gentiles. They're on a collision course, no wonder they met each other. There are some people who just have been becoming Jewish their whole lives, and I think we should welcome them. But otherwise, the process, the proselytizing, the missionary process we should be in is what we always used to do, to bring people to God, not necessarily to bring people to the synagogue.
I'm curious, and if this is overly personal, obviously feel free not to answer, but it's an interesting issue to me. At a time when 52% of Jews are intermarrying, and I'm sure it's happened to people you're close with, do you have a policy about attending, not attending an intermarriage?
I have a very strong policy about that. It's made easier for me because it's a rule of the conservative rabbinate, the rabbinical assembly, that I cannot be there in any function whatsoever.
But even in a non-function?
Joe, the reality is a rabbi can't stop being a rabbi. I mean, I go to a Red Sox game and I'm there as a rabbi. Mm-hmm. And if I should be overcome with hunger and buy a non-kosher hot dog, I am not simply doing that as a Red Sox fan. I am doing that as a rabbi who is breaking one of the commitments of my life. No, I cannot divest myself of my rabbinic role and simply be there as a friend of the family. And I have had to say this to some very dear friends of mine.
You think God has a special relationship with the Jewish people?
Clearly. I can't really talk about God's emotional state, but the historical fact is, and for me, the idea that the Jews are a chosen people is clearly not a claim to superiority. I mean, listen, I was a congregational rabbi for 30 years. If there's one thing I know beyond a doubt, it's that Jews are no better than anybody else. It is a historical fact that for whatever reason, God chose the Jewish people to make the world aware of what he was about. For whatever reason, the Jews and nobody else gave the world the Bible, the Ten Commandments, the Psalms. The Jews had prophets. Nobody else had them. I can't explain why. It is arbitrary, as all love is arbitrary. For whatever reason, the Jewish people are God's firstborn child, with that special responsibility and that special fondness which always connects a parent to a firstborn child.
Someone used the term to me once, rather than chosen, singled out. Because God needed a people for a specific task to carry the Word of God into the world. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that?
If somebody is happier with that rather fine distinction, I have no problems with that. For me, they say the same thing.
I'm curious to go back to what was virtually a throwaway line, but strikes me as something important. Do you, in your heart of heart, feels we are no better than anybody else? Not because of a metaphysical superiority, because that would seem to me to be a pretty strong statement. In other words, would you make a statement that religious people are no better than non-religious people as a group. Because if one would say that, it would seem to me to be a statement that religion doesn't have the effect of making people better, which would be a pretty powerful indictment.
There was that fascinating exchange in Shema magazine in Gene Borowitz's publication some months ago on precisely that question. And it's an impossible thing to talk about, because when you say better, what are your criteria? Is there any objective way? I'm not sure there is. One question is, not are religious people better than non-religious people? You could just as legitimately ask, are religious people better than they would be if they weren't religious? That if there is a person with real problems of self-esteem because of the way he or she was raised, and immersing oneself in a life of piety, becoming a Baal Tshuva, becoming very observant, is a way of dealing with those crippling psychological issues of self-esteem better than anything else you can do, then a religious person is not necessarily better than her neighbor, but better than she would be otherwise. So that's part of the answer. As far as the Jews go, individual Jews are probably no better than individual Christians, and some individual Christians are saintly. For much of our history, Jews collectively were, the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. The incredible statement about Jewish history, as to the degree that I've studied it, is that it worked. That Jewish communities made up of ordinary people were extraordinary. Extraordinary in their piety, in their charity, in their connectedness to each other. It really worked. I mean, we don't have to over-romanticize the shtetl. There were people in the shtetl who gossiped, and there are people in the shtetl who committed adultery, and there are people in the shtetl who cheated their customers. But taken as a whole, ordinary, not terribly intellectual, not terribly profound people created something extraordinary. They created a community where it was normative to give a substantial portion of your income to charity. They created a community where it was normative to pray regularly. I'm sorry we lost that. With the advent of the modern world and the whole concept of the individual as a freestanding integer, not part of a wider whole, I think we've lost a lot of that. And I think we're now in a world where Jews are pretty much like everybody else.
In a sense, that's what I was thinking of as you were speaking. And what I was also thinking of is, I think one of the common denominators of Jewish thinking about chosenness is whether or not we are better, we feel that we're called upon to be better. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a thought that came into my head. A friend of mine in Israel, Uri Simon, do you know Uri, who's a Bible scholar of note, once said something interesting. Uri's politics are rather dovish. So he said, it's occurred to me in Israel that the people who most firmly believe that we're the chosen people are the ones who are most apt to justify any policy Israel takes on the grounds that we have a right to be like any other nation. And ironically, the people who least believe that we're the chosen people are the ones most apt to hold Israel to a standard they don't hold any other nation. So it's like, in one form or another, I think it runs through Jewish thinking that we feel we have to justify ourselves to a higher standard.
Oh, I think so. I saw a cute ad today. I don't get to New York very often, but I did today. And somewhere in New York, I saw this poster for, it was for Empire Kosher Chickens. It says, it takes an even tougher man to make kosher chicken, and it shows Moses with the 10 Commandments. Yeah, we expect more of ourselves. I think that is a Jewish trait. I think it may be, I used the image before fairly loosely and metaphorically that we are God's firstborn. There is something, I'm a firstborn son, and so I know how it works. There is a sense in which President Clinton is a firstborn son. There was this fascinating article in the Boston Globe during the election about the fact that so many presidents have a younger brother who's kind of a scapegrace. Billy Carter and Sam Houston Johnson and Richard Nixon's younger brother and President Clinton's brother. There is the sense in which the firstborn son has this sense of obligation, of I've got to do things in the right way. And the later born child, to a large degree, is free of that. And it's a fascinating psychological study to apply that to the psyches, the collective psyches of Jews and Christians. That Jews have the sense of, we got to do it right, and Christians have the sense of, even if we mess up, God loves us so much, he won't hold it against us.
Yeah, I want to comment on something that Joseph said and that you raised, and that is, I think that part of the problem is how we've defined what it is to be a religious person. Mm-hmm. We define piety or religion based all too often solely on whether or not someone walks to synagogue on Shabbat. and not how one acts in their business. I'm not for a moment trying to minimize the importance of walking to shul on Shabbat.
David, a couple of years ago, Leonard Fine did a survey on behalf of the Reform movement of leaders of Reform congregations in America. His study was called Reform is a Verb. One of the things I learned from that is he would go to these presidents of Reform temples, say, how would you define a religious Jew? Mm-hmm. And they would say, well, you know, I'm Reform. I don't think you measure a man's piety by whether he eats kosher and doesn't work on the Sabbath. I think religion is how you treat your fellow man. Are you honest in business? Do you give to charity? Do you tell the truth? Would you consider yourself a religious Jew? No, I'm not, because I don't keep kosher and I go to the office on Saturday. Yeah, you're right. There is no consensus on that. I think there's a Jewish consensus, and the Jewish consensus would say no part of this is totally indispensable.
Exactly, but that's the point. All too often, if you ask most people, what does religion demand, or what does Judaism demand of you, it is, and I'm a big fan of ritual, and I don't mean to minimize it. And there's always a danger when one takes this tact, but I think it's important to note. People are thought of as religious based all too often solely on ritual matters and not matters of how we act towards one another on a daily basis.
Let me tell you a story, David. About the second or third year I was in my congregation in Massachusetts, the policy of the United Synagogue Youth, the conservative youth movement, was if you were a regional officer, which was a big deal for these teenagers, you had to commit yourself to certain standards. That is, you would observe the dietary laws outside the home because you couldn't control what your parents did, you would not do anything forbidden on the Sabbath, and you would attend synagogue regularly. I caused a little bit of a furor by saying to the people who were in charge of the youth group, why do you limit your requirements to those? Why don't you talk about, I mean, you're talking about 16, 17-year-old kids. Why don't you talk about non-exploitative sexual relations? Why don't you talk about not cheating in school? Why don't you talk about shoplifting? And they said, very interesting, and they took my suggestions and threw them away, and they kept on insisting on Sabbath and dietary laws. Yeah, I think we box ourselves into these things because this is, I guess this is what differentiates us from Christianity. It's sort of like the, you know, in the advertising world, the brand differentiation. You focus on what makes your product different from the competitor. And if all religions talk about being honest and being charitable and being truthful, and only Judaism talks about not eating pork chops, we define the uniqueness of Judaism as the person who doesn't eat pork chops, and I think you're absolutely right. It's partial and it's distorting.
Incidentally, I remember in a class here at the Y last week, we were talking about kashrut, and it turned out to be a very thought-provoking discussion towards me from the students. It really made me think a lot. One of the points that one of the students raised is, what is it that we Jews have against a pig? And I thought for a moment and I said, actually nothing. We leave the poor guy alone. It's the rest of the world.
Oh yeah, it's like a cartoon I once saw of a group of pigs speaking, and one says to the other, don't you wish the whole world was Jewish? Because it would obviously, but you know, it's funny, David and I were speaking about some of the issues we were going to raise. You know, and one question, which I don't think we ended up deciding to ask, but was like, if you could meet one figure out of the Jewish past, who would you want to meet? What would you want to ask him? And I said to David, I think I know who I'd want to meet. I'd want to meet Hillel for the reason that ties in with this discussion. Probably the most famous story in the whole Talmud is the story about a non-Jew who comes to Hillel and says, define for me the essence of Judaism while standing on one foot. And Hillel defines it in ethical terms. What's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. The rest is commentary, and then converts him. The commentaries on the side of the page are a little concerned. He converted him without a commitment to any other Jewish thing. I would want to ask Hillel, is that your intention? Because he really was saying that ethics was so overwhelmingly the essence of Judaism that everything else was commentary. And it's interesting in light of what we're talking about, you know, with the whole host of the defining issues. You know, what you were saying, Judaism chose to emphasize as we entered modernity, and we probably were afraid of becoming assimilated, we had a reason for wanting to emphasize that which made Jews distinctive from our non-Jewish neighbors, because if everybody was agreeing on ethics, we as the minority group might get swallowed up. But I think we've lost something in it, and what epitomized it to me, I was giving a speech once, and I asked, who knows how many laws there are in the Torah? A woman raised her hand and says, there are 613 laws in the Torah, but I'm not religious, I don't keep any. And I said to her, I have good news for you. First of all, fewer than 300 are still binding today. I said, and on the assumption that you've not had sexual relations with your mother, father, or any of your siblings voluntarily, you've already kept 3 Torah laws. And of course, what I wanted to underscore was the disservice we do to Judaism when we associate it purely with the realm of the ritual. And yet, I think what you're doing now, which is so important, is a recognition that rituals teach things that can't be taught in other ways. My friend Dennis Prager gives us an example, is actually the friend of all three of us, gives us an example of the power of ritual to teach. He once said to me, he says, when I was 6 years old, the first words I learned to read in English were pure vegetable shortening only. He said, it's not a bad thing to learn at the age of 6 that you can't have every candy bar in the candy store. You know, and that's one, and that ties in very much with your opening statement about Judaism as a system of self-control in a pagan world.
I remember one of my teachers at seminary saying, one of the fringe benefits of running an observant home is when your teenage kids want to rebel, there's so many safe ways they can rebel. You want to really drive your parents crazy, you go to a movie on Friday night.
That's right.
You want to be really wicked, you have a hamburger at McDonald's.
Cheeseburger.
Yeah, a cheeseburger if you really want to stick it to your parents. On the other hand, if you tell your kids, I don't care what you do, just don't get in trouble with the law and don't get pregnant, how do you rebel? How do you prove that you're not mama's little girl except by getting in trouble with the law or becoming pregnant? You have no other way of acting out and being independent.
And we don't do children, I think, any favor. There is such a thirst for values in America right now. I think, I'll put it to you this way, I have met literally hundreds of people who've had religious educations as children which they didn't like and are grateful for it.
Yes.
I have yet to meet, literally yet to meet, I'm sure they exist, a person who didn't receive a religious education and was pleased about it in retrospect. There is the sense that there is something missing.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, David. I think young people have a need to push and encounter something firm. And when we yield, and I think the key to it is that we are so insecure about our own values that we're not prepared to stick up for them. And so when our kids push, we yield rather than stand firm, and we just don't understand how much we're disappointing them.
You know what else strikes me as interesting? We've discussed religion now for about 40 minutes, and I think this is also in a sense distinctively Jewish, both in a good way and a not a good way, without speaking at all about God, which I think...
And referring 6 times to the dietary laws.
Yes. No, I mean, because I think characteristically, all three of us are rabbis, and I suspect that in most instances, a comparable panel of Christian clergy, had they been speaking about religion and its need in the modern world, there would have been more reference, perhaps, made to God. Now, in your, when bad things happen to good people, you, in a sense, redefine God, at least from the traditional Jewish perspective, as having limited power. Could you explain what drove you to do that and some of the reactions it elicited?
Sure. By the way, interesting, apropos of what you said, one of the responses I've gotten from my colleagues in the rabbinate to when bad things happen to good people in my other books is they have appreciated my putting God back on the agenda. I think until the 1980s, and I don't think I did this single-handedly, I had an uncle who fought in the Second World War, and afterwards used to say, I don't want to take all the credit for myself, but all I know is when I joined the Army we were losing, and when I left we had won. One of the things that's happened is in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, rabbis didn't talk about God. We talked about Israel, we talked about anti-Semitism, we talked about civil rights, and we left out the theological dimension which stands behind those issues and many others. And I think people felt vaguely cheated because they needed to know that what went on in the synagogue was a different order of experience than what goes on in the lecture hall or in the editorial pages of the New York Times. What was the question? Oh yes, my theology. I think most people in the audience have either read the book or read something about it. We had a child who was born with an incurable disease and died at age 14. And it became desperately important for me to know what was going on. Not so much why, I needed to know which side God was on. Was God doing this to me? Did God cause it? Did God want my child to suffer and die? Could he have spared him and chose not to? The conclusion I came to, and it was really a matter of a moment of revelation, cutting the Gordian knot, was that some things happen in the world that God does not want to happen. What kind of God wants cancer? What kind of God wants heart disease? What kind of God wants Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis? What kind of God wants earthquakes, plane crashes, forest fires? I had to decide that there are some things in the world God is not responsible for. Briefly, one of them is laws of nature. A falling rock has no way of knowing
who it's falling on, just obeying laws of gravity. And one of them is human free choice. From this lunatic in Waco, Texas, to Hitler, to the drunk driver who heads the wrong way down a one-way street and wipes out a family. This is not God doing it. This is a case of human beings misusing their freedom to choose between good and evil. For me, the Holocaust is not a theological issue. Why did God let it happen? Why didn't he stop it? For me, the Holocaust is a psychological issue. How could human beings have done such things to each other?
So that I share your views, and certainly in terms of suffering, for whom I hold human beings responsible. As a matter of fact, on a purely theological level, I have the question, we can go back to Cain and Abel. One can ask the question, where was God in the 4th chapter of Genesis when Cain rose up to kill his brother Abel?
You know, there's a wonderful midrash about that where...
yes, God is held, with, I think where Cain turns it around and says God is responsible. Is that
not only Cain, where God says, the blood of your brother Abel calls out to me from the earth. The midrash says, what is Abel's blood calling? And the image it uses is the gladiator who's about to be killed turns to the emperor for thumbs up or thumbs down, and the emperor gives a thumbs down sign and he's killed. Abel is saying, why did you let this happen to me? Why didn't you stop him? And he holds God responsible, and God's response is, this is not my doing, this is something a human being chose to do.
And I understand that, and I would even take it a step further, that the minute I ask, and this is again an intellectual argument, not an emotional argument, where was God during the Holocaust? I am all of a sudden taking away responsibility from those who perpetrated the Holocaust. I'm taking responsibility from the Nazis.
And responsibility is what makes us human.
Right, but what about, I make the distinction between that kind of suffering and suffering that isn't human caused.
Right.
Okay, an earthquake, a tidal wave, disease. Do you make the same distinction?
Of course.
Then when those things do happen, do you think they happen fully randomly? In other words, a traditional Jew might respond, as you beautifully articulate through the book of Job, that there is a reason for these things. I may not fully understand that God has a master plan. I may not understand the master plan, but God has a master plan. But at least it gives me solace to know that there is a master plan. You disagree with that?
I do. David, some things there is not a moral reason for, but there is a physical, biological reason for. That is, a child is born with a severe birth defect because that is a recessive gene that both parents carry or something like that. You live too close to a power line and people get some sort of disease which is caused by that. Some of this, there are not morally sufficient reasons, but there are reasons.
Right.
And my answer is, what God does is give us the power to figure out why this is happening and to do something about it. You know, I'm old enough, and anybody out there who is my age will remember why my mother wouldn't let me go swimming in June in Brooklyn when I was a child. Because in the 1940s, there was a polio epidemic every summer, and he just prayed your kids would get through the summer and not be sick or crippled. We were so outraged that we gave our money. Somebody broke the code, came up with a cure for this. Instead of raising our hands to heaven and saying, God, why do you let these terrible things happen? We applied our God-given intelligence to the problem. That's how you solve it. Some of it is random. That is the drunk driver who heads the wrong way down the highway. He is making a human choice. The fact that somebody decided not to have a second cup of coffee and is on the highway at that moment is purely random.
Do you believe that God ever intervenes in human affairs?
I would have to say no, because if I said yes, I would have to hold God responsible for all the times he chose not to intervene.
Then next month, when you celebrate Passover, and we reflect on the fact that God brought the Israelites out of Egypt and gave them the Torah, what's going through your mind?
To be perfectly frank, what's going through my mind is, how much more of this do we have to do before we can eat? At the theological level,
may be going through everybody's mind.
At the theological level, what I mean when I say those words, My guiding spirit here is a guy who I think is the best rabbi in America, and that's Harold Schulweis in Los Angeles. Harold Schulweis has what he calls predicate theology. Predicate theology means when you have a statement about God, read it backwards. If it says God is loving, God is truth, God is courage, that's not a statement about God because we don't know anything about God, and if we knew something, we would have no right to describe God with words taken from human experience. Right. So read it backwards. Truth is godly. That is, when you tell the truth, you experience God. Love is godly. Ben-Gurion used to tell the story that in the early years of Israel, he went on a bond mission to Europe. He had an appointment with the wealthiest Jew in Antwerp, Belgium, a diamond merchant. Ushered into the man's very lavish office, the man says, "Mr. Prime Minister, I want you to understand something before you start. I consider myself a human being first, a Belgian second, and a Jew third. Does that offend you?" And Ben-Gurion said, "Not at all. In Hebrew, we read from right to left." Harold Schulweis taught me that when you find a statement about God, Jews read that from right to left. To say in the Haggadah, God freed the slaves, is not a statement about, it's not a way of asking God, where were you on the night of the 15th of Nisan in 1400 BC? It's not a statement about God's activity, it's a statement about what happened to slaves. To go from slavery to freedom is to experience God.
I share your views to a point, but I'm wondering, last Yom Kippur, from here, I spoke about the Unetana Tokef, the prayer which says on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed, who will live and who will die, who by fire, who by water, etc., etc. And I remember saying it not in a non-rhetorical way with the congregation here saying, do you believe that? Do you believe physically on Rosh Hashanah your fate is sealed somehow during these 10 days? A part of me believes it. There's a part of me that thinks it's too chutzpah for me to think that I have control over everything in the world, or that God doesn't have anything to do with it. On the other hand, there's a part of me that says, but I can't fully believe that. What's going through your soul theologically during that prayer?
David, let me tell you a story. 3.5 years ago, my previous book, Who Needs God, was published. It was published just before Yom Kippur, and my publisher sent me on a nationwide tour to promote it. And during the intermediate days of Sukkot, I found myself in San Francisco on the day of the earthquake. I was standing in front of a restaurant at 5 o'clock trying to decide, should I have an early supper and watch the World Series in the restaurant, or should I go back to my hotel? And all of a sudden the earthquake struck. I remembered that in an earthquake you're supposed to look for a doorway. So I ran into the doorway of the restaurant and survived. It only lasted 15 seconds. Felt much longer, but it was very short. When I realized it was over and I was fine, my first response was, thank God I'm all right. And my second response was, now wait a minute, what do I mean by that?
I understand.
And I remember that 8 days earlier, I had recited Netana Tokef, who will live and who will die, who by fire and who by earthquake. Did I really believe that on Yom Kippur, God wrote down that Harold Kushner should survive and some other poor slob should die? I can't believe that. I've got to believe this is random. What did I mean when I said, thank God I'm okay? I understood myself to be saying, not that I am grateful to God for having made the decision to spare me. It was a spasm of gratitude. That was the way I put into words my feeling something had happened, something good had happened to me which I had not earned and didn't necessarily deserve. That when the earthquake struck, I was not harmed. Thank God is not a statement about God, it was a statement about my sense of gratitude, my sense that something had happened over which I had no control. That's one level at which I understand this. That is, I read it backwards. Not that God decided I should live, but that I survived and I experienced what I can only characterize as chesed, as grace, in the experience of surviving.
I'm curious, though, if large numbers of Jews accepted your position that God never intervenes, do you think many Jews would go on praying? Has it affected the constancy of your prayers, the length of your prayers? I would have a feeling that with that theology, if I would pray, my prayers would be a lot shortened.
No, It has affected not the length but the depth of my prayers. It has redefined what it means to pray, and I think for the better. Joe, what has happened, I think, in this country is we have confused God with Santa Claus. And we have come to understand prayer as meaning bringing before God your shopping list and trying to persuade him that you deserve it. I have a Christian friend who asked me just a couple of months ago, what do Jews pray for? And I thought about that for a moment. I said, Jews don't pray for so much as they pray with and they pray to. That is, prayer is not a series of requests. Prayer is, first of all, becoming part of a congregation. It's part of what happens with tefillah b'tzibur, with congregational prayer. I think the congregating is more important than the praying. When a service works, what happens is not that you have got God's attention. What happens is you have transcended the isolation of the self. David, you were talking about Natana Tokef. I have real theological problems with the content of the prayer. When I lecture for Jewish audiences on when bad things happen to good people, I make a little side bet with my sponsors that I bet one of the first 4 questions will be, what about the prayers we say in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? And my answer is, yeah, in my synagogue we say it in Hebrew. Because for me, the liturgy is not a matter of proclaiming what I believe. For me, the liturgy is the experience of joining with other Jews in reciting words which have been sanctified by tradition, whether I believe every nuance of the words or not. That's why my aphorism is, liturgy unites, theology divides. That is, when Jews stop chanting the prayer and let their eyes stray over to the left-hand page and read the translation, we get all kinds of problems.
Yeah, but this is more than nuance. I mean, in a sense, this is a lot more than nuance. I mean, because the prayer, the rooted idea, and I know the terrible experience, obviously, that you went through with your son, but are you saying now that when someone very dear to you is very ill, is there a part of you that instinctively wants to, whether you do or not, still pray?
Sure.
Do you?
But what do I pray for?
Right.
I don't pray as a way of bargaining with God, because I found out that doesn't work. That's not the way the game is played. I pray first, and this I think is the essence of Jewish petitionary prayer. I pray as a way of acknowledging my limitations. What's the Hebrew word for to pray, Joe?
Litpalel.
Okay, I would insist that the real Hebrew word to pray is not litpalel, but levarech, to bless. I think that's the functional equivalent of the word to pray. And the etymology of levarech is to bend the knee. To pray in Judaism is not to plead, not to request, not to submit a petition. To pray in Judaism is to acknowledge the greatness of God and the limitations of the davener. So the first thing I do is when I pray for and we're going through this now. We found out, what is today, Thursday? Tuesday night we got a call that my father-in-law in Miami is very, very sick. And tonight when I was at the Minyan, and this Saturday when I hope to be in synagogue, I will offer a prayer for his recovery. What do I mean when I'm doing that? First is I'm saying this is something which is very important to me and out of my control. If somebody were to say to me, give a certain large sum of money and your father-in-law will get better, I'd manage to give it. Take out a loan, whatever I had to do. If someone would say to me, go a week without telling a lie and your father-in-law would get better, I would do my best to fulfill that. But this is something over which I have no control. So when I pray, I'm acknowledging this matters desperately to me and there's nothing I can do about it. Secondly, when I pray for a sick person, I'm expressing hope. The hope that what the doctor said Tuesday night is not the ultimate answer, that it may turn out differently than what he said. Thirdly, when I pray for a sick person, what I'm saying is, if it turns out badly, I hope that I and my wife and her family are strong enough to handle it. That it doesn't become the kind of loss experience that affects our ability to affirm the goodness of life. When my son was very sick, I would urge him to pray, not to wake up healthy the next morning, to pray that he was not alone. Even when visiting hours ended in the hospital, we had to go home, I wanted him to be able to pray so he could feel the presence of God. That's why it was so desperately important for me to know that this was not God's doing. That God was as grieved, to the degree that we can use human emotional terms in reference to God, God was as grieved at the illness of a child as he and I were. You pray to come into the company of God. The great statement there, and you're familiar with it, is the 73rd Psalm. It is one of the great spiritual documents ever written. More people should be familiar with it. The author of the 73rd Psalm says, I look out at this world and it's such a crazy mixed up world, I don't see where God is in it. Wicked people get rich, wicked people win elections, wicked people have all sorts of power, good people are taken advantage of. I was ready to give up. And then I went into the temple, and God took me by the hand and brought me into his presence. And what the psalmist is saying, as I understand that 73rd Psalm, is, I encountered God, he didn't answer my questions, he made my questions less important. Having met God, I wasn't as upset about the unevenness of the world. That was compensation for everything that went wrong. This is what I urge very sick people, scared people to do. This is what I urge the unemployed man to do. Don't pray for a job, that's not the business God is in. Pray for a sense of worth that is not dependent on whether you're a wage earner. The 40-year-old single woman, don't pray for a boyfriend. Pray for a sense of your own worth whether you are married or not. This is what it means to pray and to invite God into your life.
Why can't you do that? I'm in agreement with you there, but why can't you do that and also ask that God intervene on behalf of a sick person?
Ask. I don't care. The catch is, if the person dies on schedule, I don't want you to think that God rejected your prayer. I have some friends who say, and I think they're being very clever when they say it, God answers all prayers, but sometimes his answer is no. I hate that. I absolutely reject that, because the implication is God could have spared your mother and chose not to. And then the question is, why? Because my mother didn't deserve to live? Because I didn't deserve to have my prayer answered? Because I didn't grovel enough? Because I wasn't articulate enough? Because God is mean? I don't like any of those answers.
And also, in a sense, from what I'm understanding then, your understanding of God is grounded in the thought that if God could intervene and didn't, he would maybe be worthy of fear, but you couldn't love him.
You're right. If I thought for a minute that God could have spared my son and chose not to, I'm finished. Finished. Nothing to do with him. Right? He can strike me down if he wants, I don't care.
And yet, I just want to understand, what does it mean that God can't? I mean, that's why I'm saying here we come to the, in a sense, the redefinition of God. Are you saying God is bound by rules that he created, that he set the world in motion?
Oh, the first thing I'm saying is I don't know. That is, I don't know on what basis God made the ground rules. What I do know is, empirically looking at the world, I come away convinced that whether he couldn't or whether he could have and chose not to, God does not suspend the laws of nature, no matter how worthy the cause is. Would it have been so hard for God to deflect the bullet that killed John Kennedy 3 inches to the right? That's all it would have taken, and the history of this country would have been different. Or the bullet that killed Martin Luther King. Would it have been so hard for God to cause a streetcar to run Adolf Hitler over when he was 12 years old? It would not have taken a lot on God's part. If I thought he could have, not for my purposes, for his purposes, why didn't he do it? No, I've got to believe that God, my preference is to say that God decided at the outset he's not going to mess with the laws of nature.
Then is God responsible in some way for the birth of a child? And if the birth of a child, if it's a healthy child, we often thank God. What do we do? How do we turn to God if a child is not healthy?
Well, that's like my answer after the earthquake. When I thank God that my child is born healthy, I'm not making a comment that it was in the hands of God. I'm articulating a sense of gratitude. I had no control over it, and I'm just so grateful that it turned out well. Walter Kaufman calls this theological gerrymandering. That is, you draw your definition of God to include all the good stuff and leave out the bad stuff. And I'm guilty of that, I admit it. Because you see what I'm doing, I'm not coming up with a psychological profile of God. I'm cataloging all those moments in a person's life in which God is present.
You beautifully analyze our routine responses to what people often say in the case of a tragedy. I think the example that you give in your most recent book, I don't remember if it was that one or When Bad Things Happen to Good People, you tell the story of a child whose parent had died. and someone is consoling that child and saying to them that it's beautiful in heaven and that the child should be happy now that his or her mother or father is now with God. You then go on to explain.
It's worse than that, David. I remember it. That story hit me so hard, I've used it in 2 of my books. It happened when I was a rabbi in Great Neck. 16-year-old boy, mother died of leukemia. Going from the burial to the house of Shiva, I walk in, and the boy's aunt, the father's sister, is saying to him, "Don't feel bad, Barry. God took your mother because he needs her more than you do."
Right, and you explain what a terrible thing.
Three atrocities in one sentence.
Then having been so open about your own tragedy and saying that your friends tried to help, but what could they do? What should a friend do? What should a friend say to someone who has suffered a tragedy?
It's very simple. Say, "I'm sorry, I feel bad for you," and keep your mouth shut and listen. We do more good by listening than by the most articulate statement. When I was a young, inexperienced rabbi, I would hear that there had been a death in a congregational family. I would go there to try and make them feel better. I'd walk in and everybody would jump on me. They'd say, "Rabbi, why would God let this happen to such a nice person?" And I thought they were asking me about God, and that's great. I know about that. I've taken courses in it. And I would give them a 10-minute summary of my senior theology course from the seminary. And when I finished and their eyes had glazed over, I would say to them, "Now I understand this is a little bit technical. Maybe you didn't get it the first time. Would you like me to repeat it?" They'd say, "Rabbi, please, we've suffered enough." No, what I tell people now is somebody going through a hard time wants consolation, not explanation. Just hug him, hold his hand, reassure him he's a good person. You know what it's like, David? Your best friend says to you, "What did I ever do to deserve this?" He doesn't really want you to tell him all the things he did to deserve this.
I understand, and I remember when I entered rabbinical school that all of a sudden everybody, from the minute I was accepted, thought I could answer every theological question in the world, and of course I had no ideas. Very often, I would meet a Holocaust survivor who would look at me in the eye and say, "How can I believe in God after the Holocaust?"
Mm-hmm.
And I felt it would be absolutely chutzpah for me to respond. Who am I, living in the United States, growing up in a warm, wonderful situation, to say anything to a person who has suffered so much?
Mm-hmm.
So for 10 years, I did exactly what you suggested. I quietly acknowledged and said very little. Until one day, after a Yom Kippur service, a woman introduced herself to me, said that, "But Rabbi, how can I believe in God after the Holocaust?" And I just quietly nodded my head and tried to console her without words, or listened, to which she grabbed my arm and she said, "Answer me. I want to know why."
Mm-hmm.
What would you have said? What can you say then?
What I have said, and I'm never comfortable saying it to Holocaust survivors, because no matter what tragedy I've gone through in my own life, it's dwarfed by what they've gone through. But when I would teach adolescents in my congregation, and I teach a course in modern Jewish history, we'd study the Holocaust, what I would say to them is, without God, what makes Hitler wrong? That is, unless you believe in God, not a God who controls everything, a God who stands for righteousness, who demands righteousness of us. Unless you believe in that God, why was Hitler wrong? You have no right, you have no grounds for saying what Hitler did was terrible. You can say what he did was painful. I hate him, I'm sorry he did it, I'll never forgive him. You can't say he was wrong unless you believe in a God who stands for standards of right and wrong.
Do you believe,
take God out of the picture, and how do you say that?
Do you believe in consequence in an afterlife? I would
Is that
assume
one
you do.
question or
Let me
two?
tell you why I would
Yeah.
assume you do, because I'm trying to figure out something. If in fact the understanding of God that you've come to allows you to go on loving God because he's not responsible for this evil, nonetheless, if God created a world and there is no afterlife, and Adolf Hitler and Anne Frank have the same fate, I think you're back to the same problem of in what sense can one love God?
All right, first of all, I have no way of knowing whether there's an afterlife or not, and I have no way of knowing what happens to Adolf Hitler and Anne Frank on the other side of it. But Joe, how can you say that in this world, Adolf Hitler and Anne Frank have had the same fate? Except for the fact that they've both died. How can you say they've had the same fate? When one is virtually canonized, and one is the constant symbol of defamation. You can't think of anything worse to call somebody. They have not had the same fate. What I believe is when somebody dies, the physical processes stop and the body decays and so on. But I would have to insist that there's a part of us, an essential part of us, which cannot die because it's not physical. What I'm comfortable calling the soul, what a secular person would call personality. It's everything about me which is not physical. Because it's not physical, it cannot die. That much I understand. What I don't and what I will never understand, what does it mean for a soul to exist without a body to incarnate it? My brain can't get around that question. I can't comprehend what it means for a non-physical entity to exist. So I don't even think about it. I find in this world that Anne Frank and Adolf Hitler have not had the same fate. I find in this world that people who have lived a righteous life make the world a better place. People who have lived a selfish, wicked life make it a nastier place. And that is their... Sometimes I'm tempted to say that Olam Haba, the world to come, is not a different space but a different time. That refers to the future. That the reward for being a good person, whatever happens to your soul afterwards, we cannot comprehend. It's like trying to explain to a fetus what it feels like to wear clothes and drive a car. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you could find a way of telling it, it couldn't understand. That's what it's like to try and explain to us three-dimensional, material, earthbound people what it feels like to be a disembodied soul. I can't understand what will it mean. Will my soul know it used to be me? Will it be able to recognize other non-physical souls? How do two non-physical entities see each other? I can't understand the question, let alone the answer. I do believe that we at least achieve a measure of immortality in this world through what we've done. Oscar Wilde has a wonderful line that I like to quote. He says, "The most wonderful feeling in the world is to do a good deed anonymously and have somebody find out." I have to believe that when one of us does a good deed anonymously and nobody thanks us and nobody applauds us, not even the good deeds we do, the bad things we don't do, the temptation we manage not to give into, the angry words we withhold, and nobody could possibly know how hard it was for us not to do those things. I gotta believe somebody finds out. That at some level, the world is changed because I chose not to give in to temptation.
Mm-hmm.
Then how do we bring a sense of God into a world? Do we influence our children to believe in a God that cares? Do we influence our children to believe in a God that without God there is no concept of good and evil, there is no sense of right and wrong? Is the best way to bring a sense, my feeling is the best way to bring a sense of God into the world, certainly in the life of a Jew, is to show the beauty of God, to show the Shabbat, to remove ourselves. You know, I know how many times people have said to me, there's no spirituality in Judaism. Yeah. Yet we are given this gift of spirituality one day a week. You know, you can feel a lot of things walking in Greenwich Village on a Friday night, but a sense of Jewish spirituality isn't necessarily one of them.
I believe that. Who is this we that we're talking about, David?
I think that
is it all Jews? Is it committed Jews?
No, but it's clear to me that many Jews are looking for a sense of Jewishness in their lives. Mm-hmm. Is the best way to do that through experience, through teaching, through passion, through touching lives, through the pulpit?
I'm tempted to say the best way is to buy my book, but I don't want to get into that. No, I don't think you teach children to, not just to believe in God, that's not the issue, to recognize God by lecturing them in theology.
I agree with you.
I think what you do is you role model, you incarnate it. Periodically, when I was a congregational rabbi, I would meet with the Hebrew school staff and the nursery school staff, and I would say that the religious content of what we're teaching ought to include teaching children to recognize the presence of God. That when you do what every nursery school in the world does, when you teach children to plant a seed and watch it grow, that is not a lesson in agriculture, in biology. It ought to also be a lesson in theology. That this is, you know, the plant growing, things growing, children growing, you fall down, you scrape your knee and it heals. What was hard in September you can do easily in March. This is the experience of God. The satisfaction, the good feeling of sharing your toys with another child and having another child like you and share his toys with you is an experience of God. To be sick and to recover is an experience of God. The 30th Psalm is Mordashir Chanukah Tabayit. What that is all about is a person saying, I was sick and I was desperate and I was miserable and I recovered, and in that experience I encountered God. Not because God chose to spare me and let some other sucker die, but because, as I've been saying all along, that sense of something important happening over which I had no control taught me to encounter the presence of God in my life. When I teach that God chooses not to prevent people from doing wicked things, the other half of the answer, and this, I think I am on mainstream Jewish ground when I say this, the Torah makes the audacious claim, God can do something harder than preventing people from doing evil. He can take their evil and turn it to good. And my example is the story of Joseph and his brothers. You remember that? You guys remember the story. They remember it too, I'm sure. Joseph's brothers hate him, jealous of him. They sell him into slavery. Through a series of events, he ends up as a minister in Egypt. He's in charge of food distribution. The brothers come. After a whole series of things, he reveals himself. And then Joseph says, and this is the climax of the entire story, it is one of the most important verses in the book of Genesis. Joseph says, you intended to do me harm, and God turned it to good. That's what God does with evil. He doesn't slap people's hands away from the cookie jar and make it impossible for them to lie, steal, commit adultery, hurt each other. God takes the evil and shows people how to make something good of it. God could not reverse the laws of biology and spare my child's life. What he did was, he gave my son the incredible capacity to face the prospect of dying at age 14 and not be shattered by it. And he taught me how to go through that experience and not be disillusioned by it. And he guided me to transmute that experience, to redeem it from being a statistic and turn it into something that helps other people. This is what God does. Teach people to encounter God in these things. Teach young couples that their love for each other is the presence of God in their lives. Teach young parents that the blessing of a child and the ability to love a child is the presence of God in their lives. Teach elderly people who are facing terminal illness that the insistence of their friends and relatives not to write them off, when it is no fun at all to visit somebody who is very sick, that this is the presence of God in their lives.
Just one final thought occurs to me. Two of your most noted books have had rather somber titles, When Bad Things Happen to Good People and When All You Ever Wanted Is Not Enough. I was very struck by the sort of joyous, upbeat title of your newest book, To Life, which obviously brings to mind L'chaim, and also a celebration of Jewish being and thinking. I gather this was an intentional focus on the joy of Jewishness.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'll give you a couple answers to that. First of all, I don't deserve full credit for the title. My editor, Jim Silberman, and his wife, Selma Shapiro, contributed to that. They wanted to emphasize that part of it. But that's the way I feel about Judaism. I feel it's wonderful. It's not simply a way of meeting your obligations, of satisfying a demanding God. It's a way of transmuting fun into joy, of taking things which would otherwise be mundane. I mean, statistically, there is nothing more common than the birth of a child. Judaism teaches you how to see the birth of a child as something messianic, as something extraordinary. And we respond to that. We want to believe that the birth of a child is something special. We want to believe that our daughter's wedding is not simply biology and legality. It is something transcendent going on there. And the other part of the answer, Joe, is, you know what, you get to the point where I don't want to be the authority on tragedy. I was on the road once on a lecture tour, and Ted Koppel was trying to reach me to appear on Nightline on a program about how to explain to parents the death of a child. And there was a mix-up in hotels. The hotel got the date wrong, didn't have a room for me, I had to stay someplace else, and Koppel couldn't find me. And frankly, I'm just as happy, because it would have been very hard for me to say no to Ted Koppel. But I don't want to go on being the authority on dying children. That's why I wanted to write a book about celebration, about the joy of being Jewish.
Rabbi Kushner, thank you for bringing a little taste of messianism to our life now.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.